The Sony Xperia 1.6 is Sony's top Android phone, and it'll seem pretty familiar to existing Sony fans, even with a significant change to the screen aspect ratio versus the Sony Xperia 1.5. Using the Xperia 1.6 feels like meeting an old friend. A lot of the typical Sony strengths and weaknesses are here too. The Sony Xperia 1.6's key charm is in the way it rejects several contemporary smartphone trends. It has a headphone jack, it has an expandable memory, it doesn't have a camera cutout on the screen, and Sony hasn't cut down battery capacity just to make the Xperia 1.6 marginally thinner. These will all seem smart moves to a good chunk of the phone buying audience out for something a little different, and you still get high-end camera hardware, a top-tier chip, good speakers, and an eye-catching screen. Just about all the usual elements expected of a pricey Android phone. The Sony Xperia 1.6 does cost a packet though, and arguably isn't hugely competitive considering some of its slightly less advanced parts. These include slower than ideal fast charging, camera processing that still lags a little behind the best dynamic range optimization, and nighttime image processing. We also found the rear disappointingly prone to visible scratches despite the use of high-end toughened glass. A big part of the appeal here is the handful of features that Sony's Xperia 1.6 shares with much lower-end phones. There's still a 3.5mm headphone jack and a microSD slot built into the SIM tray. These aren't expensive features to implement, but are vanishingly rare in phones of this level. The Sony Xperia 1.6 is a lovely phone, but you had better buy into its specific style for the outlay to be worthwhile. The Sony Xperia 1.6 is priced just like its predecessor, but unlike the Sony Xperia 1.5, this phone isn't slated for release in the US. In the UK, you'll pay £1,299 and $1,899 in Australia. That gets you a 12GB RAM and 256GB storage configuration. There's also a 512GB storage version available in some territories, but with a microSD slot on board, seeking one of these out or paying more for the additional storage may not be all that appealing. The phone was announced in mid-May 2024, with general availability in June 2024. The Sony Xperia 1.6 has a design much like the phone before it. This look, a no-nonsense block, has been Sony's house style since 2012. The Sony Xperia 1.6 has an elongated 1080p screen, one with a much lower pixel density than its predecessor. The screen is made to save power. It's a 120Hz refresh display, but in its default mode, it drops right down to 15Hz when displaying static content. It's got 3 rear cameras with an array not dissimilar to that of the last generation. There's a standard camera, a dedicated zoom, and an ultra-wide. It runs on Android 14 and has a largely inoffensive, not too invasive custom interface layer grafted on top. At a time when Google and Samsung are obsessed with AI, Sony's angle is still to reference the other parts of Sony as a whole. As you'd expect, the Sony Xperia 1.6 feels excellent in use. It's responsive and fast, and games run great. It also avoids the overheating issues in earlier models. It's got a 5000 mAh battery. It's an ordinary size for bigger phones in general, but larger than that of plenty of thinness-obsessed flagships. There's some bad news too. As usual for Sony, the Xperia 1.6 doesn't include a charger. Its charging rate is also pretty poor for 2024 at just 30 watts. It takes 86 minutes to reach 100% and continues receiving power at a lower rate for a while after that. 50% in 30 minutes doesn't feel like rapid charging anymore. Not for this money anyway. Sony pitches the Xperia 1.6 at the same price as its predecessor at £1,299. It's among the most expensive phones out there, and its slight deficiencies stand out markedly at the price. The merely acceptable low-light performance, slow charging, and moderate screen resolution aren't the most comfortable match for a phone selling at this high a price. Meanwhile, features like a 3.5mm headphone jack and microSD slot, which are somewhat defunct from many flagship phones, help claw back some value for the Xperia 1.6, but can't make up for the high price.